Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about evaluating sources. So let's start with the classification of sources. We're going to talk about primary and secondary sources, what these are, and how you might use them for your research purposes. We're also going to talk about where to find sources and how do you know if a source meets the academic stipulations that you need to include it in your research. So let's start with primary sources. So, a primary source is a firsthand or original record of an event created during or shortly after it happened. So, some examples of primary sources are going to include things like diaries and journals, letters, speeches or interviews, official documents, even things like creative works like artworks, poems, music, things like photographs, videos, audio recordings, or even artifacts or relics, things like clothing, tools, or furniture from a particular time period. So, why are primary sources important? For a couple of reasons. They give us a direct look at the past from somebody who was actually there. They're capable of showing a person's thoughts, feelings, or experiences at that time, and historians and researchers often use them to analyze and understand the past. So let's talk about secondary sources. A secondary source is created by someone who was not there during the event or the experience. So let's talk about some facts about secondary sources. Oftentimes they explain, analyze, or interpret primary sources. They're one or more steps removed from the original event. But sometimes they do include things like quotes, pictures, or graphics from primary sources. But it's important to note that they were made later by somebody else. So, examples of secondary sources are going to be things like textbooks, biographies, edited books or collections, book and movie reviews, articles that explain or analyze research, political commentaries, and even things like art or literary criticism is going to be considered a secondary source. Secondary sources are important because they help people understand what happened by adding explanations, opinions, or even analysis. Writers and researchers use them to support their arguments, to develop new ideas or theories, and oftentimes to agree or disagree with other researchers. And when you are practicing academic writing, you might not always have both types of sources. So, for example, if you're writing an essay about climate change, you're likely going to have only secondary sources. You're not going to be handling the raw data. But if you're writing a film review and you're not using anything other than the film and your brain, you don't have any secondary sources. You just have the one primary source. So let's talk about where you find these scholarly sources. We're going to talk about the good, the bad, and then the questionable. So let's start with the good. So the best case or the best place to look for research sources is peer-reviewed scholarly journal articles. I'm not going to say the peer review articles are perfect. Obviously, they're not. If you look at something in a medical journal from 1950, it probably has some, information that we have proven to not be true. But it's still the best option out there. You have to look at what's current and kind of understand what is happening in the field. Nonfiction books can be a good place to go to find information that you need for research purposes. There are certain websites that you can use. You just have to be a little bit careful and do a little bit more of your own digging to make sure that the information that you're getting is factual. Websites at end.edu are websites of an educational organization. Websites that end in .gov or .us are government websites, and websites that end in .org are organizational websites. So those are usually going to be better choices than websites that end in .com or commercial websites. And then the last one that I have listed up here is expert interviews. if it is possible to interview an expert on whatever it is you're writing about, this is a great way to lend credibility and ethos to your writing. Now, one of the things that sometimes confuses students is the word articles. A lot of times your professor will say, hey, you need 3 articles for this assignment. Now, this word is tricky because articles is what we use for the things that appear in newspapers, the things that appear in journals, and the things that appear in magazines. But when your professor says this, they're almost always talking about journals. And journals are very different than magazines or newspapers. So scholarly journals have authors with credentials. That means if it's a medical journal, it's going to be written by a medical doctor or a medical researcher. Journals are going to include abstracts. These are short summaries. A lot of times journals do not have advertisements, and they're usually printed in black and white, and they're usually published quarterly. They're not very fancy looking, and this is because they don't make their money from advertisements. Journals are incredibly expensive. That's because they are marketed towards educational institutions, researchers, and experts in that field. They're not necessarily for mass appeal. Whereas magazines will sometimes give you the author of the article, sometimes not, but they're usually not an expert in that field. There's usually not an abstract. And then magazines, of course, if you've ever stood in line at a grocery store, you know that they're printed on shiny, happy, colorful paper, that they are full of advertisements, and that they are often published weekly or monthly. Magazines do not make money from the articles that are in them. They don't even make money when you pick up that issue and purchase it. It costs more to print it than it does for you to buy it. They make money off the advertisement. And so it's just a different level of credibility. So when your professor says 3 articles, double check with them, but you can be pretty sure that they're talking about peer-reviewed scholarly journal articles. So that's the good. Let's talk about the not so good. These types of sources are not considered scholarly and not appropriate for many academic assignments. So the first one I have up here is personal websites. Generally, you want to go to an expert for your information. We kind of live in an era where everybody is told that they should have an opinion on everything, and you can think and feel whatever you want to feel, but we're still going to go to experts for reliable information. The next one up here is Wikipedia. Wikipedia generally has good information, and it can be a good place to start your research process, but it's not something that you ever want to use as a credible source. One of the issues with Wikipedia is circular reporting, where Wikipedia will write about something and then an article or a news outlet will publish the information from Wikipedia, and then Wikipedia will turn around and cite that news article as the source or the verification of the information that it originally published. You also want to make sure that you're staying away from overly biased websites or works of fiction or opinion as academic sources. Now, if you're writing a research paper on a work of fiction, then that's a primary source, not a secondary source. But I wouldn't use The Grapes of Wrath as a historical source about the Great Depression. Is it an excellent novel? Yes, I recommend everybody read it, but it is a work of fiction, not a credible historical source. Now, let's talk about AI for just a second. There's a lot of great things that AI can do for us. Finding sources is not always one of them. If you ask some generative AI programs to find you research sources, Sometimes the program simply fabricates the sources, and it doesn't always know the difference between what is an authentic source and what is a fabricated source. So if you are using AI for research purposes, please make sure that you are verifying and double checking everything for yourself. The reality is it takes more time to double check AI's work often than it does to just do the work and the research yourself. And you can find out more about this on the library's website. They have a whole little series that they have done about research and AI. So let's talk about checking for bias. So there's going to be some level of bias in anything that we read, whether it's written by a human or AI. You just want to be aware of what's going on. A lot of times we have obvious bias. The Wall Street Journal is conservative. CNN tends to be liberal. The Catholic Digest is going to be religious. That's not inherently good or bad. We just want to be aware of those things. But sometimes there's hidden bias that is either intentionally or unintentionally deceptive. So let's talk about what those might look like. So we have 5 types of bias here listed, and I'm going to go through them. And then in the next slide, there's a couple of examples of what that might look like. So the first one is selection bias. This is where a news outlet may choose to cover stories that support a particular ideological viewpoint or political viewpoint while ignoring others. Then you have placement bias. This is where we put articles that align with a particular narrative in prominent places, while opposing viewpoints are buried deeper or even omitted altogether. You have loaded language. This is when we use emotionally charged words. If I said brave whistleblower versus disgruntled employee, even if I'm talking about the same story here, that can influence a reader's perception. Sometimes you see the omission of context or facts. Sometimes stories leave out critical background information that would give a reader a fuller understanding. And then the use of experts or sources. A lot of times we will see biased pieces only quoting experts or sources who support their side or their viewpoint of an issue. So let's talk about an example of selection bias. So during the 2020 U.S. protests following George Floyd's death, some conservative news outlets emphasized incidents of looting and property damage, while liberal outlets like MSNBC focused more on the peaceful protest and the violence from the police officers. So what we see here is each outlet selected events that aligned with their audience's views, and they created differing impressions of the same national event. Sometimes you're going to see loaded language. So, for example, let's look at how CNN described the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. It says Biden ends America's longest war, versus how Fox News described it. Chaotic withdrawal leads to Taliban takeover. So the choice of words here, ends versus chaotic, subtly guides how the reader should feel about the event. Sometimes we see an omission of context or facts. So in 2022, a lot of local U.S. news outlets reported dramatic spikes in crime, while failing to mention that crime rates were still significantly below historical highs. So they left out that context to create this skewed perception of danger. And then the last example that I have up here is the use of expert sources. So for example, if we're talking about climate change, some outlets will give equal time to climate change deniers despite the fact that there is scientific consensus on this. And what they're doing is they're acting like these fringe voices are equal to mainstream experts. That this is two sides of a controversial issue versus something that is settled science. So That's the good and the bad, but what about the stuff in the middle? Let's talk about newspapers, trade magazines, periodicals, and even opinion pieces. There is a time and place for these types of sources in academic writing, but it's important to recognize that there's no guarantee of credibility here. So the thing with newspapers, magazines, stuff like that is that these are meant to, like, the job of a newspaper is meant to sell newspapers. The job of a magazine is meant to sell magazine. Profit is the goal here versus reliability and credibility. So you just want to use them carefully with the recognition that there is no guarantee of credibility. So if I need scientific data, I'm going to go to a science journal. If I want medical information, I'm going to go to a medical journal. If I want legal information, I'm going to go to a legal journal. I'm sure you see where I am going with this. But like, I had a student a couple of years ago who was studying the economy and wanted to write about the 1929 stock market crash. So one of the things that he did is he went back and he found newspaper articles from 1929, right around the time that it was happening, and he studied what people were saying about the crash then versus how people who study the economy talk about that event now. And he kind of compared the two. That's a great use of newspaper because he was able to sort of capture the zeitgeist at that moment and see how the people from that time felt about what is happening in real time. But like I said, this isn't where you would go for credible scientific or medical information. So, where do we find these sources? Library database, your college library. Like, going to the library, working with a librarian will always be the best way to find these sources. You can also go to the library and get a TechShare card and take that and go work at other libraries. SMU has one of the best law libraries in the country. You can go and you can study and research there. The University of North Texas has one of the best music repositories in the country. If you are writing about that, you can go and you can research and study there. In general, academics work with other academics, and lots of librarians at other institutions will be happy to help you. And then there are also other online databases that you can use. I both love and hate Google Scholar. The reason I love it is because I feel like it always suggests exactly what I am looking for, but the reason that I hate it is because it's usually behind a paywall. This is why I suggest using library databases, because you can see what is available for you to use and access. So when you find something that you want to use, it is then your responsibility as an academic researcher to evaluate it. And these are the criteria that I want you to look for. The first one is relevancy and timeliness. When was this published, and does it matter? If I'm writing about Shakespeare, it probably doesn't matter if it was published in 1850 or 1950, right? Hamlet was written in 1604 and it hasn't changed since then. But if I'm writing a research paper on, medical advances, something published 5 years ago might be completely out of date. If I'm writing about AI, something published 6 months ago might be completely out of date. So think about your topic and how timely your research needs to be. Then I want you to look at the credibility of the source. Does this source usually publish credible information? Is this a reliable place to get information? Look at the credibility of the author. What are their credentials? If they're writing medical advice, they should be a medical doctor. If they're writing legal advice, they should be a lawyer. They should be an expert in their subject. Look at the references or citations. Anytime you find quality, credible sources, they are going to tell you where they got their information. Look for objectivity or bias. Is there apparent bias? Is there hidden bias? What's going on there? And then the last thing that I want you to consider is the currency. Who paid for the study? Who paid for the article, the research, the publication, and does it matter? It's just interesting to me to look at, for example, how the newspapers that Jeff Bezos owns speaks about Jeff Bezos versus the newspapers that he doesn't own. Because who paid for it matters in the end. So when you find a source that you think, hey, this will be good for my research purposes, I want you to go through each 6 of these criteria and kind of make sure that it checks all of the boxes. If you have any questions about this, just shoot me an email, and I am happy to go over this with you. If you ever are struggling to find sources, let me know, and that's something that you and I can work on together. Or if you're ever just not sure about a source, feel free to send it to me, and I'm happy to look at it and give you the thumbs up or the thumbs down or some maybe, but what about this? But regardless, I am always here to help.